this showing just one screen or lots?
One screen.
One screen, marvellous.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, right. So welcome everybody, and welcome Professor Teresa Cremin. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak for us. I'm really looking forward to this actually, because although reading's not my area of expertise, I'm really interested in wellbeing. So I'd love to see or hear about the connection between the two. And just as a brief intro, Teresa is Professor of Education Literacy at the Open University, a Fellow of the English Association, the RSA, and the Academy of Social Sciences, and was, not still, but was the Director of Cambridge Primary Review Trust, also a trustee of the UK Literacy Association. So really very influential in the area of literacy and working with children's reading. So we're very privileged to have you here today. Thank you very much for agreeing to come and speak to us about this really interesting topic. Okay, so whenever you're ready, Teresa. Oh, sorry, just before we start, I'm just going to say, if there are any questions as you go along, if you want to put them into the chat, please feel free. We'll deal with them at the end so that we can discuss, you know, generally issues arising, but there'll be certain points where Teresa's going to actually ask you to chip into the chat, and that'll be really, really helpful. Okay, thanks. Sorry, Teresa.
No worries at all. And thank you very much, Avril and Ellen, Jade, for inviting me. I'm going to be sharing the sort of findings and our understanding so far from an exploratory study that actually arrived at the OU for us to do, but I'll explain how that happened a bit later on. This is my colleague Becky Coles, who has been doing the work with me in this seminar. I'm going to try and set the context, then explore the research literature around reading for pleasure and well-being, and then reflect in particular on the children's perspectives, both on reading and on their sense of agency and sense of self and well-being. And then I'll be introducing our mixed method study, which was with Year 5 young people, and then heading towards offering some research insights, very kind of emergent. We're exploring these connections rather than being really clear and fixed about them. We're still in that stage of having analysed the data, but then revisiting and refining. And then I'll close by trying to draw together what we see of some of the connections between these two strands of thinking, of being. I'm sure you're very aware that the World Health Organization has seen positive mental health as a state of well-being in an individual who's realizing they can cope with normal stress, an individual who's productive and fruitfully makes a contribution to their community. But it is true to say that the more you read around well-being, the more, a bit like creativity, it becomes that kind of slippery concept, which isn't always easy to define. But we've done it from the context of the OU, and let's start with a bit of that wider context to think so now. For the last 3 decades or so, one could argue that children's right to independently read, to choose to read, there may not be pleasure, there may be pain, but they're choosing to do it. So volitional reading, recreational reading, their right to be recreational readers has been recognised, perhaps, for example, by the International Literacy Association, and children's rights to their own, enhancing well-being, rather than seeing it as ill-being, the opposite of ill-being, but actually flourishing and developing, increasing flourishing, rather than the absence of ill-being, have come to the fore. And as these quotes highlight, though, there's a bit of a challenge here, because we're saying children have the right to volitionally read, but not many of them are choosing to do so. In fact, in the UK, we have the lowest levels of reading enjoyment since 2005, according to the NLT, and that's when they started their studies. And that figure in the second bullet represents over 70,000 young people's survey results. And if we look to well-being too, we can see, for example, in the most recent Children's Society 2022 report, that there are declining levels of reported happiness, and the DFE in their current State of the Nation, which is an annual report now started in 2019, have highlighted that anxiousness is increasing amongst our young people, primary and secondary. And of course, we have the wider context of being post-pandemic, post-COVID, and huge concerns about resource and money, to be able to pay for heating bills and for food. So in that context, we've got something that has become kind of quite zeitgeist, reading for pleasure and well-being, but very, or rather highly, problematic. So I'm trying to kind of highlight here really that these two have both recently come to the attention of both policymakers and researchers in the UK and well beyond. If you can see over there on the left, the national curriculum mandated reading for pleasure, as if you could require kids to read for pleasure, but it did, and I'm glad it did. In 2014, but in 2021, the reading framework came out, the foundation stage, later this year. The next stage, which will be for years 2 to 9, will come out, and that has a strong element focus on reading for pleasure too. And then, as I referred to, the State of the Nation, which started back in 2019, but highlighting there the power and influence of reading for pleasure. So, sorry, of well-being. So they kind of, come together at a particular moment in history. One could argue there are plenty of other things that are also on the agenda, but I suppose in terms of my exploration of the two, I'm trying to, well, for my own reading of the research literature highlights that these two have emerged not quite coterminously, but fairly closely related. So I want to just explore what I mean by reading for pleasure briefly and by well-being as a subjective experience and then move on. So reading for pleasure is associated with that choosing to read is associated with higher reading attainment and richer academic success. It's not causational, it's correlational, but there are a very strong range of international studies, many, many more than are just listed here, that show that if you choose to read as a childhood reader, you're going to be flying further and faster than your peers who do not choose to read. And in addition to that attainment and academic success, reading for pleasure pedagogies pay attention to the social nature of reading and to readers' identities and sense of communities as readers. And looking there across both into Ireland and in the States, Moses and Kelly's work, showing that when children gather together as readers, they begin to develop new relational connections. So I think it's really salient just to be saying, for myself at least, that's what I'm deeming to be reading for pleasure, that is associated with wider academic and potentially relational connections, but also it's all about volition, choosing to do it. So you can give me a book to read, but that's not reading for pleasure. That's reading for you, for the system, rather than reading for me. I might and read on to the next chapter, perhaps, then that might be me shifting from an extrinsic, I'm required to read it for homework, to gradually intrinsic, but only if I'm actually going to keep reading that book and many others volitionally at home. And then if we turn to our understanding of reading as a subjective experience, and I'm choosing to look at it from this angle because that's how our research is looking at it in relation to a subjective experience that arises in relation to life circumstances. And here we can see the hedonic well-being includes cognitive aspects and focuses on, as it says there, life in general, satisfaction with different domains, and emotional and affective aspects too. But eudaimonic well-being focuses more on fulfillment and is often understood through models such as the core needs model, self-determination theory, which many of you will know about, Deci and Ryan's work, which highlights that for us as humans, all humans, not children, all humans, we have 3 core psychological needs. We want to have autonomy in our lives, we want to be competent and seen as competent, and we want to be connected to others. It's hugely important for us as social animals to have that sense of connectedness or belonging. So that gives, I hope, a sense of where I'm coming from. In terms of my own research context, I'm not going to go through these, but just to say that this study, as you can see there, was 2022-23, has emerged on our table at the OU, being through the School Library Association. But we have been exploring different aspects of reading for pleasure, not well-being, but different aspects of reading for pleasure, and particularly developing our understanding of the social and relational nature of reading for some time as a team there. So I'm drawing in this particular presentation tonight on OU research that highlights the social and relational nature across those 12 studies. They aren't all on that, but they all evidence it in various ways. I'm also drawing on the OU's Research and Practice Coalition, which is really knowledge exchange and impact work, working with teacher reading groups across the country, trying to make relationships between teachers such that teachers can make relationships, reader-to-reader relationships with the young people. But particularly in this talk, I'm drawing on our new research, which came through a data sharing agreement with the School Library Association and Bounce Together. Bounce Together is an organisation, commercial one, that offers young people the Sterling wellbeing for children score scale. And they have gathered a range of surveys over many years now of young people's attitudes to and engagement with wellbeing in terms of their kind of sense of wellbeing. And at the same time, they had on their website a School Library Association survey, which was about attitudes to reading. And they came to us and said, we can't mine this data. We don't have the potentially the skill set, as it were. We're different organisations. Would you be interested in it? And so Becky and I came together and said, we'd love to look at your quant data, but we'd like to add some qualitative data to that, because large scale statistics, as we all know, give us one window on the understanding, but coming from a sociocultural understanding of reading and learning, we wanted to get closer to the evidence. So we ended up designing a mixed method study, which draws on both quant and qual, the quant given to us from Bounce and SLA, and the qual collected by us as we've travelled on this particular journey. So that gives you a kind of piece. We've gone through data sharing agreements. We had the whole thing on hold for about 5 months while universities take their time, as they do, but appropriately so, to go through and to check ethically, appropriately, and so on. And that's where we're at now. But just before we move on to look at the actual research literature and then the study, I thought I might like us to think for a minute about our own reading and well-being. All right. So I just wondered, these are some of the books that have deeply engaged me over my life, many, many more, but these are some of them. I wonder if you could each name one book, not one of these, unless you've read it and it moved you, but one book that deeply engaged you. That may have been a deep engagement in irritation with the book. It may have been a deep emotional engagement. I don't know the nature of your engagement, but if I think of that as something that really got you, that really caught you, or that really angered you. So can I just ask you to pop one in the chat, please? I think we're about a dozen folks, so hopefully there'll be a dozen or so names of books. No need for the author unless you can remember it. I recently finished Many Different Kinds of Love by Michael Rosen, and thanks, Kelly. Kelly's offering Once by Morris Gleitzman. Very punchy, isn't it? Once, Then and Now. Indeed, Next, I think, is the fourth one. And Mike's Many Different Kinds of Love is really moving, really uncomfortable reading. Some of it is written by nurses. Indeed, some of it is the nurses' reports while he was unconscious in the bed. And they're wondering whether he's going to come round. And a really thought-provoking and engaging pieces of writing. I agree, Sarah, The Kite Runner, Husseini, is a very powerful text. So there are different books being named by different ones of us. I just wonder whether you know what it was that engaged you. I could be honest and say I know Mike reasonably well, so I was engaged by what happened to him then, as it were, and then saw the visuals on television and social media that he was somehow a little different when he came out, and that he was amazed to be alive. And so I suppose there was a personal connection, but then suddenly to read these nurses' notes, and it came out while the pandemic was still running, so he was back home and safe, but so many weren't. So for me, there were lots of possible layers of connection, and yet I finished it. So if we think about reading for pleasure again, go back to choosing to read, I chose to finish it. I didn't put it down. Another colleague has said Little Life there, yeah, and Yanakahara, and that's one of the most painful books I've ever read. I had a personally sort of physical somatic response to that text. So thinking about our well-being in those particular, my two examples anyway, there was pain involved, but I continued to read, and I would say I enjoyed them. Although enjoy, we could debate the expiration of. I think now I'd like to share a little bit of a couple of children's literature texts and ask you, just as you begin to hear these, to listen, what's happening in your mind, what's happening in your body, what's happening in your human response to these. I'm thinking of our well-being, our sense of self, our concerns. So over to you. This book's called King of the Sky. Can I ask you just to think, do you know it? What do you think it's going to be about? No need to answer, just pondering, trying to give us a chance to think about our own reading and our well-being at this moment in time, online. King of the Sky by Nicola Davis and illustrated by Laura Carlin. It rained and rained and rained. Little houses huddled on the humpback hills, chimneys smoked and metal towers clanked. The street smelled of mutton soup and coal dust, and no one spoke my language. All of it told me, this is not where you belong. Just one thing reminded me of home. The sunlight, fountains, and the vanilla smell of ice cream in my nonna's gelateria. It was Mr. Evans's pigeons in their loft behind my house, cooing as if they strutted in St. Peter's Square in Rome. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Just ask you to think, feel what's going on. When we get inside a text and become absorbed in a text, do we go other? Do we get taken elsewhere? I can't, of course, read the whole text to you, that would be copyright, and we're online, but I'm offering just that and wondering. Mr. Evans's face was crumpled and he could hardly walk, but when his birds flew, he smiled like springtime. I stood beside him and I watched as his pigeons soared above the chimneys and the towers, up to where the sky stretched all the way to Italy. I'm going to close that text now and move to just 4 pages of another. The Monster Bed by Jeannie Willis and Susan Varley. Never go down to the Withering Wood, for the ghosties and goblins are up to no good. The gnomes are all nasty, the trolls are all hairy, and even the pixies and fairies are scary. Oh, never go down there unless you are brave, in case you discover that cobbledy cave. For inside that cave, which is gloomy and glum, live Dennis the monster and Dennis's mum. Now, Dennis the monster was mostly polite. He tried very hard not to bellow and bite, except, I'm afraid, when the time came for bed. I'm frightened, the wee monster said. But why? Asked his mummy. There's nothing to fear. I've given you Teddy, the light switch is here. The humans will get me, cried Dennis. They'll creep under my monster bed when I'm asleep. Okay, perhaps you have a piece of paper in front of you, perhaps not, perhaps you want to write in the chat line, entirely up to you. But I'm wondering whether you could just take a moment to consider your thoughts. What were you thinking about the tales as they unfolded, or indeed the story you mentioned, Annie Yanagihara, about the experience? Either add it to the chat line or scribble on your own, but I'm trying to help us capture, does even a tiny window of reading offer us something different? I tried to choose 2 very contrasting books to give a different kind of mood. Just going to ask us to think for a minute and then I'll move on. The very last line, just to honour you all, is flown down into the arms of the smiling, crying boy, the boy who knew at last that he was home. So you get that powerful line, everything told me this is not where you belong. And then Nicola delivers the goods because it's a children's book and she gives us hope in the ascendant. But you have to travel right through the book and there are plenty of lines that suggest this is not going to happen. And we can, as educators, give it all that weight. So that was me setting the context. Rather too long, actually. I haven't done this before. I'm going to have to speed up. My apologies. Now, let me explore some of the research into reading and well-being, some of which I expect you know already yourselves in various ways. There has been research into adult reading and well-being. And Josie Billington's work, based around the Reader Organisation in Liverpool, has highlighted the relationship or the offer that literature enables when we have literature-based intervention groups that offer and support adults with dementia, adults in prison, and indeed bibliotherapy. There have been bibliotherapy groups since almost the beginning of time, as it were, in terms of documenting, and those articles show that adults are supported by sharing text together, maybe not children's fiction, as indeed these two teachers are, but by sharing a book in common that connects us, a common book. And we now have 2 books in common, snippets from, albeit, but King of the Sky and The Monster Bed, that although I can't see more than Avril, I know you've heard and had voiced in some way. And reader motivation studies highlight, as Kristen Conradi-Smith does, that engagement in reading is affective, cognitive, behavioural and social. And I suspect that those engagements are evident in the context of many adult reading groups and literature-based intervention groups to support the elderly or indeed those in prisons. There is also research around teens and undergraduates. I always find this first one, Gabrielle and Young's, very interesting because the title of their paper is called Becoming a Vampire Without Being Bitten. And they talk about how through reading diverse range of texts, but in particular Twilight, young people can develop a sense of belonging. They are, in effect, develop a kind of mood that the study shows how these young people are provided with the same mood and satisfaction that they get from affiliations with real life. So there's a degree of para-belonging, belonging to the text and assimilating my sense of understanding of the text. And that shows us really powerfully the need for social connection. Library report there by Margaret Merger in Australia, highlighting that teens report that libraries really help them with well-being because they give them a quiet place, that sense of belonging and a context for connection that isn't about being assessed, but is low-key and enabling. So there is research with teenagers and undergraduates as there is with adults. When we come to the world of younger people, children, there's very much less research in that particular space with regard to young people's reading. I'm just finding my notes, yeah. And indeed in well-being, there's been a very big shift towards let's listen to the young people, let's honour their perspectives about their own well-being and not talk about their future well-being, but actually their well-being now. So now rather than future, although leading to that future. So, for example, the National Literacy Trust have done studies that highlight there's a relationship between reporting high levels of literacy engagement and book ownership. And those young people who reported those were more likely to report higher levels of well-being. Again, kind of quite large stats without the depth. No criticism, just a reality. There have been some dog-assisted programs. Reading dogs have become more common. They aren't common, but more common in primary schools. And they claim well-being benefits, but it's very difficult to isolate it, I would suggest. And then in 2021, a survey of the NLT again, Christina Clark and Irene Picton highlighted that between 8 and 18, young people, over half of the young people who reported reading to relax, and they agreed that reading made them feel better. During the pandemic, reading became a refuge for many of our young people, a space to go. Although it is true to say that I know many adults who said during the pandemic, I couldn't read anything. I couldn't get to a space where I could relax. So let's not make it all a kind of, positive frame, just understand it better. And then Impact Ed and NLT have just published, or did last year, a large-scale study again that showed that young people with higher levels of confidence and enjoyment in reading, i.e. those who read for pleasure, tend to have higher well-being and lower anxiety than their peers. Again, all the time highlighting the notion of numbers providing us with evidence, or at least with claim, in relation to that kind of correlation between reading for pleasure and feeling better about myself, feeling positive, or feeling negative about Michael Rosen's experience, but coping with his experience and handling the emotions, my emotions that surface when reading A Little Life, for example, and therefore sustaining a positive well-being despite having gone through the pain of the book itself. So those give us some kind of sense of that, the wider well-being and reading for pleasure work. It hasn't really been developed, this work, much with young people, as it were. Sarah McGowan is actually undertaking a study now, which is at 3 phases. So she's looking 9 to 12-year-olds. I don't know exactly the age band, but something like 20 to 35 or 40-year-olds, and then over 65. So a Leverhulme Trust study, which is looking at what does reading and well-being look like at those 3 age phases, and that will enrich our understanding. But we haven't had a lot of work in this country, at least, or indeed abroad, that focuses on children. In particular, then, we need to be paying more attention, I would argue, to the children's perspectives. These 3 studies highlight what kids think about reading for pleasure, what they value. Wilhelm, quite a small study in Canada, found that 5 kinds of pleasure were identified for teenagers: immersive pleasure of play, the intellectual pleasure of reading, the social pleasure, the pleasure of doing functional work, and the pleasure of inner work, understanding myself. He argues at the end of the paper, however, that the only pleasure that's supported in school, in secondary school, is the intellectual pleasure. And he makes an argument for the wider range of other pleasures that the young people could engage in. Howard's work, again, but slightly younger group, with 9 to 12-year-olds and a rather larger cohort, 60 young people, found they valued it for social reasons, for academic reasons, and for personal reasons. So you can see, as you begin to move in there, some potential connections with well-being, that sense of a secure sense of self and a sense of agency emerging, particularly in those social and, well, indeed, actually in all 3, really. And that lovely piece by Agnieszka Kozmikova, who works in Prague, fantastic researcher, she's explored that sense of becoming lost in a book, and basically highlights that there isn't one tune here, but there's deep diversity about how young people engage in their reading, using cue methodology, quite an interesting way of understanding that. If we move then to look at the subjective well-being from the perspective of children rather than the focus on the reading for pleasure, we can see that many studies, Fatura in particular has been strong in this area, and a colleague called Ben Aria's work has highlighted that that sense of being, having and doing helps, but agency, relationships, competence, security, that sense of safety and safetyness, not safety from danger, but safety in context with others, and coping strategies are frequently seen by children as central to well-being. So what Becky and I have tried to do is get into both the quant but then into the qual, and begin to understand through the lens of reading, listening to experienced, keen readers, how they view reading, what are their views on reading, and then begin to extrapolate out from that. What are they telling us about well-being when they discuss reading? What are they understanding about well-being, or not explicitly understanding yet? So in Fatura's work there, children understood well-being in terms of relationships and emotions. And he highlights really clearly, as indeed do several others, that positive and negative experiences were seen to be intrinsic to well-being. We're stuck with this term, aren't we, reading for pleasure? I wish we hadn't coined it that way in the government, because some of the reading we engage in is not pleasurable in the sense of creating a smile, but it's pleasurable in the sense of understanding more about the world or engaging with the world. But if we chose time again, I think we might be wanting to call it not, reading being, as it were, but volitional reading, choosing to read. And well-being has that strong sense of agency running through. Powell describes it as a positive state well-being that captures young people's contentment and overall sense of purpose, as well as day-to-day happiness. So connecting back to that eudaimonic and hedonic way of looking. So just one last slide, and then we'll move to the data itself. So some more underpinning principles emerging from the way in which young people describe it. They describe emotional life and relationships with others. Relationships are absolutely ridden through this, and activities that offer relaxation. That might be sport, doesn't have to be reading, but they highlight that they feel better and they have strong well-being when they've got good connections with others and they can relax. And then in school, young people highlight the role of supportive enabling relationships. And we know that education is an act of participation and that relationships matter in education. And young people are saying, well, then my well-being is being impacted by those relationships too. Equally in school, the power of particular pedagogies to constitute empathetic, non-judgmental communities where all are valued and all have a place have been highlighted by the young in Clark and McKellen's study as supportive places for well-being. So they describe they feel good in places where there is strong receptivity and non-judgment, a non-hierarchical setup, perhaps. So that was me giving a sense, I hope, of some of the data that shows looking through children's eyes, listening to children, respecting their now well-being or lack thereof, and learning from them and their perspectives on reading for pleasure, help us see more of the, develop a better understanding of well-being and reading for pleasure through their eyes, rather than through the kind of received wisdom, which is, well, it'll make a difference to academic attainment. Well, it might be broken into various ways. We can see that scholars shape these concepts, but children live them and they experience them as we do in relation to reading those books. And so I think it's a really positive view that not only is it a child's right to well-being and to volitional reading, it's their right to express their view around that. So now I'm going to move on to our own study based on the work that or the data that was shared by Bounce Together and SLA. So we looked finally at 962 kids aged 7 to 11 who completed both those surveys. So we had to find the kids who'd done both surveys across that single year. The Sterling Wellbeing, Children's Wellbeing Scale, and the Attitude to Reading Survey. We conducted a series of regression analyses. I have to say I didn't. Becky did with another colleague from the statistics group here, and we used 3 controls in every case: the FSM as a proxy, and gender, and EAL. And our question really that was guiding that was, are there any relationships between children's reported attitudes to reading and reading for pleasure and their sense of well-being? So it's reasonably large. It's quite a large age span, but they've undertaken both those, and it's the same children, obviously, in both. And I'll come to the results of that in a couple of slides. And then our qualitative strand, we identified 3 highly renowned teachers, obviously anonymous, from within our Reading for Pleasure community. Teachers who each of them have won awards for their Reading for Pleasure work within schools through DFE and other forms of awards. We invited them to take part in the study, and they were all teaching 9 to 11-year-olds, year 5 and year 6 at that time. And we visited them in classrooms. But prior to the visit, I had undertaken an online interview with the class teacher. At the moment, we have begun to analyse that, but we're not very far with that particular data set. So what I'm showing today is coming from the young people. Right, and then it was, I mean, obviously it's a purposive sample. We were looking for teachers who we perceived might, although we'd visited 2 of the classrooms before, not all 3, might, and not in the year that they were observed, might have established were likely to have established strong reading communities in their classrooms where there could be relational connections around reading for pleasure. And Becky went and led an activity, or the teacher led an activity that we set up around the emotions when we read, and then Becky led the focus groups and then individual interviews with 15 children. So we've got many hours of data that was then transcribed, and all of that activity was based on the books that the class had been reading, each of the 3 classes, different books obviously, and the children had been reading. We were insistent on both the current book and the previous books in common, the class books, being evident and available to the young people, so being reminded of them, that became part of the piece. And then we insisted on all of the children in the class, because it was a class activity to start with, and then the focus groups bringing both the current book they're reading and any previous books they could find. So some came with 4 and 5, some came with just 2. We were trying to help trigger their memories and connections so that they weren't having to think, well, what was that book by Catherine Rundell, whatever else. The conversations around the focus groups and the interviews focused on how does reading contribute to your life. We explored where they choose, when and where they read, what feelings reading elicits with them, who they talk to, and we asked the question if books had ever influenced them. It was a very conversational encounter, and so lots of wide-ranging material shared. And in terms of the quality of analysis of this, it was obviously all audio recorded and then transcribed, and then we used NVivo using the sensitizing concepts I'd already presented about subjective experiences of well-being. And then Becky and I have been going through an extended iterative process of coding, recoding, revision, axial, etc. codes emerging and then reorganizing until we're heading towards we've got 4 categories with three subcategories in each. So we do have 12 codes, and we then recoded the entire data with those 12 codes data set, asking the question, what might the discussion of reading for pleasure by these avid 9 to 10-year-olds reveal about its role in their well-being? So we didn't explicitly ask them any questions about well-being. Indeed, we asked them, the teachers, explicit questions about well-being, and they said, what do you mean by it? I don't know what it is. Do you mean the PSHE curriculum, as it were? So it wasn't as if we're dealing with teachers who have developed their understanding of well-being per se, but these teachers are, I would argue, reading teachers who read and readers who teach. So that was where we've come from. Now, let me give you some of the research insights now, and then we'll have some time for questions. So the quant findings, we did observe a slight but significant correlation between attitudes to reading and reading well-being scores. Not reading well-being scores. But there were stronger associations between specific questions, and I found that really interesting. These were they: reading frequency. Those young people of the 900 who'd completed the 2 surveys 2 years before, by the time we're analysing them, who reported reading every day, reading in the holidays, visiting the library regularly, had significantly higher well-being scores, very largely significantly higher than their peers. Reading enjoyment, and this was where the highest differential was, those who agreed with the statement, I read because it's fun, had a much higher well-being score than those who disagreed with that statement, which is very interesting. Those who actually agreed, I'd be happy to be given a book as a present, were also had much higher well-being scores. In terms of social interactions around reading, the children who agreed that reading is cool had higher WB scores, and those who reported that they read books suggested by friends. So they were conscious of that. It's something in my culture, it's something in my practice, and indeed in my social network, as it were. And they had significantly higher well-being scores. So I think we can see here that there are, again, repeating the Impact Ed and the National Literacy Trust survey, some connections between that, not causation, but again, a correlation between those who read avidly and with pleasure and for fun and think it's cool, so they don't read quietly at home, but they recognize themselves as readers and come out as readers and accept books that are suggested by their friends. They had significantly higher well-being scores. So we wanted to get underneath the surface of these kinds of large-scale figures, which have, as I said, been quoted elsewhere over time. And that's when we started to get into our qualitative data analysis. And this is, at the moment, our emerging 4-framed framework. There are 3 codes within each of these 4 strands, and I want to talk you through just a couple of examples from each of the strands and then try to draw that together. So in terms of transportation, it was clear to us going through the data that emotion, perhaps what I triggered rather obviously earlier on, but maybe that I didn't necessarily mean to, I did it spontaneously, but taking pleasure in the experience of a strong emotion, or in the children's terms, a suspense, because they talked quite a lot in these classes about read aloud, because their teachers read aloud very regularly. So they're not only readers, but they're reading, being read to. And as Paige says here, with the last bear, I was really nervous for the bear to see if he was going to make it or not. And I'm happy he did. And he became stronger and stuff. So it made me happy. But also I was anxious because sometimes I didn't think he was going to make it. And I felt sad for him because he lost all his family, like when he was all on his own on Bear Island. So I felt sad for him. So Becky asked, yeah, so it's all different emotions in the book, different points. How was it to feel those emotions? Like to feel worried? It was really good, says Paige, because that's what a really good book does. That like makes you feel emotions, makes you feel emotionally connected to them. And Raffi comes straight in going, if books have no emotions to you, it's not a brilliant book. But if they have loads of emotion stuff, you feel it makes it like a proper good book. So in a sense, these young people are showing us they value the emotional engagement, but even if it's sadness, and a lot of them talk about sobbing and crying with particular books, but reading on and not delighting in the tears, but being able to cope with the tears because they feel sufficiently secure. They know, perhaps, as I showed you at the end of King of the Sky, that the denouement will offer hope, or at least they have hope that it will, and take that journey. So as with Fattore's work, these young people seem to be aware, unconsciously perhaps, that they could cope with positive and negative emotions, and that the emotions were a driver. We've had a lot of quotes that refer to, I read on because not only I wanted to know, but because I was really involved. As another child says here, only a really good book can make you feel like that. So they really value the emotional power and suspense of tales and get transported through so doing. If we move to a second dimension, subdimension of transportation, we found lots and lots of examples. This was the second highest category here in finding sanctuary from different kinds of situations or feelings, difficult ones. I feel it's soothing when you're like, I finally escaped the world and I can just be myself and I can just read and I can take my mind off everything. I don't have to worry about school. I don't have to worry about homework, nothing, because I've done that. Just open the book, read it. Lovely. Now, these were focus group conversations, and we found the children were very vocal in the focus groups, talking over one another, joining in, knowing what each other were offering. Here's a child, though, a particular child being, or focus group 2, sorry, in another school. And Amos is saying, sometimes I just read to escape. And another child comes in, and then Joe says, I do get that, because a couple of weeks ago, there was a big argument between me and a couple of friends, and we didn't really talk for a while. So I just read, really. And then it just feel like everything went away, and there wasn't anything to worry about. There were multiple examples, actually referring to home, not just school, of children choosing to go to read in order to step away from, not to relax, although mood and calm was the third strand, our third subcode in here, which I'm not going to give any detail to, but that sense of removing myself from a situation because reading is a sanctuary, not just a calm sanctuary, but a sanctuary away from challenge and pain. I love that phrase. It feels like a soothing sensation. So she can't cope with the homework and the worry about school, but she can soothe herself through the books. Okay, so now if we move to agency, that's really clear. This is going to be a big piece. Agency isn't just, though, about choosing which book to read. It's choosing not only the reading materials and where I might read, when I might read. So being agentic is not about the book per se. It's about much more than that, having that strong sense, as we know from wellbeing research, of being able to shape your own agenda, your own life. And here again, we hear from Millie and others, but I'll just go to the bottom line where there's talking about reading in bed and mum saying, you've got your 10-minute timer, etc., etc. And she reads another page and another page and another page. And then Riley says, that happened to me with Wild Boy by Rod Lloyd-Jones. It was like, it was really good and I wouldn't put it down. And we went back to the transcript for this because I said, did he say I wouldn't or I couldn't put it down? And we found the word wouldn't. I will not put it down. I will do what I want to do. I am agentic, is what that W says to me, at least. And that's highly related to a wellbeing agenda. Another, and not unrelated here, of course, is that sense of feeling one is and is recognized by others and is a competent or skilled reader. And we saw many, many examples of this in the transcripts. Just looking to see if I've got another one in here where, sorry, I just can't find that note. Oh, yes. In these classrooms, we were very aware of how 3 separate classrooms, 3 parts of the country, they know one another, but they don't know they're all involved in the study, but so they're not connected in that way. But in the classroom, there's a strong sense of connection. And the young people were recommending to Becky, well, if you like these kind of books, you should go and ask Ishmael because he likes those kind of books. They were highly aware of each other's preferences and practices as readers. And as I mentioned, the conversations were very fluid. So there's a strong sense of self-efficacy being shown here. In this particular group, they're talking about how in a younger year, some of the children don't find it hard to find books that they like. So this crew, some of this crew, go and recommend to others, spend their library breaks recommending books. Spend their breaks in the library recommending books. And as they say to Becky towards the end, it made me feel proud of myself that I can recommend books. Yeah, it makes me feel good that I just help somebody pick up a good book. And I know that's good and they'll enjoy it because of what they've told me that they like to read. So it's not just, I've got a book, I can give it to him. It's, I've listened to you and I've found a book that might suit you and now I feel proud about it. Strong sense of being, having efficacy as a reader. And as Vittore says that in this sense, children can act freely, they can exert their influence, and their experience of themselves, is I'm okay, I'm valued, I have a role, yeah? Not just with younger years, but with other peers within. And then if we move to connection, and these last two are perhaps the easiest for us to see in relation to the connections with reading. So empathy was very evident in all 3 classrooms, where the young people talked about connecting to a character and then relating ethically to that character or others. I love Mariam's quote here at the second one. She says, I feel like books, sort of the whole point of books is to get a point across in the world. She realizes, although she's 9 or 10, she realizes that there's much to be learnt in these books, as she comments back to Ellis when he talks about The Ways to Be Me and how it's spreading awareness about the disability autism, because it's really good in a book to teach you how to treat people and they should be treated as equals with others. There's another lovely quote here by Joe in a one-to-one interview. There's always a message in books. He says, say if it was a sport book and it was something to do with teamwork, then it's like, don't give up and that. Because quite a lot of books, say it was sport, you lose loads of games and then someone comes and helps and then you start winning. We really valued that comment because quite a lot of their comments were related to narrative. But here he seems to be implying we're learning also about the world and individuals and others' experiences through the narrative fiction they're engaging with. And you'll notice I've included the visuals of some of the books. And I think this is really important, actually. When they brought books with them, they tabled them. Sometimes they picked them up, some didn't as much. But we know that texts themselves can trigger not only a memory of the narrative of the book, but sometimes of the way in which we felt when we were reading that book. And reader response theory that Louise Rosenblatt and many others have written about highlights that for us. And then another sub-dimension of connections was connecting to the world, using the text to understand and then act on it, pro-social action. So Mason says here, we read The Last Bear together as a class. Like that's inspired me to recycle more and like reuse stuff. And then The Last Bear, Millie says, The Last Bear helped me understand more about pollution and climate change. Maybe we can do something about it in the future. And Rafi comments in this conversation here in FQ1, I went to the beach the other day and there's loads of plastic everywhere. So instead of playing with my little brother, I started picking up some of the plastic on the beach. Now, this is a young man who's talking to a visiting researcher. He's not playing the game called I know how to do the right thing in schooling, as it were. They're in the library, they're sat there, really easy order, and they're chatting. And Becky said it was really very much a conversation in these kind of focus group contexts. So I think I'm interested in how his sense of connection through the text is enabling him to feel good about himself, mixed up with other elements here, self-competence. I can take actions in the world because I can pick up on the beach. And then moving to the last one, the strand that we're calling currently relatedness, building those social bonds, connecting back to Ryan and Desi's work, but there doesn't seem to be a better word for it. And we're still debating some others. And so in relation to this, there was lots of data around how I use books, how I let books help me connect to my friends and my family. So here's Joe talking about, I talked to Miss Wexford and my nan, because my nan is big. I call her a bookworm. So I get to my nan's, walk through the door. She's still reading a book that she read last week. And I'm like, Nan, do you ever put that book down? She goes, no. Do you tell her about what you're reading? Yes. She always goes, what are you reading, Riley? I go, Pages and Co. I always have to take a book every time I go round. So that sense of him having a closer relationship with his nan because she's a reader and he's a reader, and she's both encouraging his reading, but also developing that sense of deepening relationship with her. And Rafi rather thoughtfully saying at one point in a focus group, you find your type of people through reading. I thought, how wonderful is that? He's saying, I can find my kins, I can gain kinship through reading, my friends who have the same kinds of values. There's lots of discussion in these classrooms. It isn't formal reading in these classrooms, although there is teaching of comprehension. There is a lot of conversation in the corridor. I've visited 2 of them, in the corridors, in the lunch break, outside on the playground, about reading, because reading is a communal activity in these particular places. And then relatedness, a last quick one, about finding a sense of companionship with the characters or others. As Mason says, and many children comment on almost exactly this sentence, reading helps because it doesn't make you feel you're all alone. The phrase, we're not alone when we read, or I realize I'm not alone feeling X or feeling Y or being angry, you're not alone, is very common in the data set. So to close, really, I want to show you the grids that we're working to, and to highlight there was one other code I couldn't give an example of in each in these 4 strands. And then I had one observation, but I think I need to time up. So I had one observation to go with each, really one comment. Sorry, I've overplanned, or perhaps I did too much talking about the other books in the beginning. My apologies. But those are the 3 strands of transportation: emotion, mood, and escape. And we can see that affect is a driver, and emotions are powerful within RFP, but then well-being involves handling those emotions and coping with them and developing resilience. And then in terms of agency, choice, learning, and competence are the 3 subcodes. And we know that choice and agency are core to reading for pleasure, which is volitional in any case, and that children with strong well-being feel that they have control and are agentic. So agency is core to both. And then making connections, and we're still debating this title actually, but empathy, worldliness, and self-knowledge seem to be the 3 substrands here, and that's highlighting how children, well, rather reading involves an exploration of myself and others, and developing empathy through the world that can lead to social action, and that well-being is recognised by young people as acting responsibly and making decisions, and they see that as part of well-being too. And then finally, that sense of closeness, recognition of myself as a reader, and para-belonging. And again, we know as readers ourselves that reading is a social and relational practice as well as an individual one. But when we look to well-being, we can see how reading is fostered by that sense of self-worth. And that sense of self-worth is anchored in a sense of belonging, in a sense of usness, as you see in this lovely picture from Newham in London, and experiences of positive recognition of me as a reader, you as a reader. So to close, I'm trying to reform our kind of, 4 basic strands here into something a bit more fluid, and it was the best attempt I could make last night to create this. So sorry, but I just wanted to say we don't see them as a list, we don't see them as hierarchy, and we do see them as overlapping. But I couldn't somehow get a diagram that showed everything overlapping everything. But you can see where I'm coming from, at least in the attempt to do so. So I think, alongside Becky, that potentially reading and well-being are working in reciprocal relation with one another, having lots of features in common, feeding and enriching and mutually reinforcing each other. But of course, that's only for those young people who are really keen readers. For those who are not, if we go back to that second slide, for the 47.8% who do not care to read, and with that massive decline in volitional reading, we may see a decline, if the argument I've made has any validity, in their well-being also, because they can't find their sense of agency, their sense of connection, relatedness, or be transported through the power of the text. I hope that's useful to folk, and do please ask questions. I threw some references in at the end there for you too. So thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And kind of from my years in school, I kind of can relate to the enjoyment that the children in at the end of a lesson where they go, can we go to the reading corner and pick a book up, and they sit and share books together, and it's really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. What I'll do first was there's a couple of questions in the chat. I'll ask those, and also once we've once we've been through those, maybe people might want to ask questions verbally as well. We'll see. But so Dan has asked, what should a school timetable look like to encourage choosing to read? Our special school is considering having a daily 30-minute reading opportunity every morning at the start of the day. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I would say that before you actually have the kind of required reading time, because if it's daily reading time, it's kind of school-led required, there'd be a lot of work put in on reading aloud, book recommendations, trips to the library, so that the young people eventually can have in their hands a book that they've chosen and that they'd like to explore, they'd like to look at with others. They may not be looking at it alone. So it may be, two children are looking at a magazine together, two others are looking at something online together, and 5 others are actually reading independently. Because to support them as readers, we have to take the journey towards the independent reading rather than necessarily kind of require it immediately. Some of those in special school and indeed in mainstream will be able to read, but don't have a positive reader identity. And so my sense would be to try and support them on the journey towards that by making reading more social, more relational, and with recommendations from peers, so that they feel, I've chosen this, I'm going to invest some time in it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, interestingly, Martin's asked a question here, something that popped into my mind actually as well, is the use of audiobooks. And has your research seen any impact from audiobooks with children listening to stories as a means of engaging with stories, books for pleasure?
No, I haven't, but the NLT did, I'm going to say, I think it was 2021, and found that unsurprisingly, during lockdown, audiobooks became more popular, but that has been sustained in that boys in particular had found pleasure in them. These particular classes are very well served with a wide range of books. You might imagine, both owned by the teacher and bought in, and they're all language coordinators. And so in these classes, I'm not saying you don't need audiobooks, but they haven't got many because there are so many print books, both in the classes and in school libraries, that the young people do borrow. So we didn't even hear a child talk about an audiobook in all the 64 hours of recording. But thank you for the question. I'm sure you can get powerful pleasure through listening too. We all have, haven't we, over time, listened to audiobooks and valued that. But the extent to which they're giving us a moment of calm, possibly, a moment of refuge, as it were, a moment of sanctuary, will vary depending on what the previous context we're in. But it's possible, again, that young people who parents having around an evening as a stereotypical way, but there are plenty of examples of those in this data set, might not go up and read their own book, but they could go up and put the audio book on and try and switch off in that context to listen and get lost in the story rather than living in the angst that they're in at that moment, or listening to the angst downstairs.
Yes, that is an interesting point, actually. A different type of escapism almost to the reading aspect. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Dan said, thank you, really inspiring. Can we please get a copy of the slides or a link to the recording to share with colleagues?
Yes, there is a link to the recording. Well, I mean, there isn't one yet, but there will be. So I think that's probably the best way of getting it, because then it's spoken live, is brought to life a bit more, isn't it? Rather than, just looking at a slide, which isn't telling you so much.
No, you don't get the full sense of it, do you? Definitely. Okay. Are there any verbal questions or any other questions people would like to put into the chat?
I'd love to ask Jenny if I can do it the other way around, but we probably should go. But and just to ask Jenny what you were thinking. Does it seem to connect to, you're so experienced as a reader yourself and a recommender? I'd love to know what you're thinking.
It connects on quite a lot of levels, to be honest, in terms of the work that I work very closely with my colleague in Liverpool who leads the whole school approach to mental health. And we've been doing projects that look at the links on reading and mental health. And so the different sort of dimensions you were looking at very much linked to some of the conversations we've been having. But I mean, and I know this was about young people and not in terms of adult readers, and I'm obviously an adult now, but at those same dimensions sort of connected to me as someone who has, you know, mental health problems and anxiety problems, and reading is my go-to for that. And I think when you look at those dimensions, you you're like, that's exactly what I'm getting from it. So yeah, connected on a
Very
sort of
interesting, Jenny. Thank
work
you.
and personal level.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, honestly, we've had so many different category names, and that word connection is not necessarily going to be the last one. But I said, well, I'll present with that word for the moment, because if we're going to change it, we don't know what we've changed it to. Well, we've got about 9, but none of them work quite as well as connection, but we still think connection's got problems, because connection, of course, is related to relatedness, and therefore it seems like you're saying the same thing, which they are different in kind. But the vocabulary sometimes just isn't big enough to describe what you're trying to capture in that piece. But we're working on a paper. We're, you know, about 5,000 words down. So hopefully we'll be submitting it, you know, in the next 2 or 3 months. And if that then gets out somewhere, I'll ping you an email, Avril, because, you know, you might want to add it to the website so that people could know where it finally gets. But it'll probably take another 6 months after that. So let's wait. Don't hold your horses on it, is what I'm saying.
It does take a while, doesn't it? But yes, that would be really good, because it'd be really good to share it with our students as well when they're learning about reading for pleasure, in any format, really. And I must admit, I do agree. I kind of struggle with the term reading or teaching children to read for pleasure, because I've always felt like there's a bit of a contradiction, or not even a contradiction, but how can you teach someone to take pleasure in something? So it was interesting to hear you.
You can model it, you can invite it,
Yes.
you can inspire, you can encourage, but you cannot make them read for pleasure,
Yes.
because it's an act of volition. So what we're really trying to do is autonomy facilitate in school. We're trying to foster their choice and agency, their desire. And that's, I suppose, very similar to well-being, because we can't make them have well-being, even if we surround children with lots of money, lots of clothes, lots of toys, whatever. It's absurd, but you see where I'm coming from.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily avail them of that well-being. So, you know, to have well-being and to choose to read for pleasure, agency is king. Other things too, as I've highlighted, but agency is critical to that, and we can't make people have agency. We have to give it away and enable it. Yeah. And that means we lose some of our own, in quotes, pedagogic control, because we're trying to foster theirs.
Yes.
Now,
one of the things I spotted early on, but I think it was only in one of your slides actually, that one of the pictures or images that you used were some children reading outside, and a lot of the other images were of children reading inside. Was there any correlation there about the space that they used for reading, or was that not something that you factored in?
I mean, to be fair, the photographs are not of obviously these children. They're photographs that we've taken for the reading for pleasure work. So I use them a bit randomly, if I'm honest. But in 2 of the schools, there is regular reading outside, as it were, if you choose to do it. Now, when we were filming and, or rather when we were doing the interviews, it was the summer term. So some of it was, you know, happening outside on a regular basis. But that's, again, rather given by these teachers as an act of, shall we read outside? Do you want to? And in one classroom I visited, half of them were reading outside during reading time after lunch, and the other half weren't. They were sitting where they wanted, and the teacher was, you know, in between. But then the teacher was reading too. So they were given the choice again about where you sit and, you know, what you're reading. And some of them were reading and talking to others. Some of them were reading, most of them were reading on their own, but some weren't. Some were sharing books. Snuggled up somewhere. So, and one of these schools runs a forest school, which is a forest school reading club, which is friendly for those who choose to go, but nonetheless it's, you know, another space, isn't it, to read in. So the kids read up trees there, literally climb the tree and take a look.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, Jenny's put here about agency being key. Loves this supporting schools to give children agency is at the heart of a lot of both the MHRFP work we've been doing with Liverpool schools. So, and again, I suppose that space that you're talking about there is again giving the children agency in that, you know.
We
Yeah.
often think agency and choice is about choosing the book, but they're choosing far more than that in a classroom of reading community. They're choosing who to sit with, whether to talk about it, whether to recommend it to somebody else, whether to finish it. Some of the children talking about giving up on this, and they were actively encouraged to do so should they choose to wish to do so.
Yes.
Rather than actually carrying on pretending to read for the next 3 weeks and carrying it around to apparently pretend I'm a reader. Well, these kids know that if they don't like it, they're allowed to step away from it. And I'm not saying they're all avid, secure readers, but these are very strong relational connections in the classroom. Becky was pretty amazed, I think, as a researcher, how many recommendations she got for particular books. She said, I'm looking for this. You ask him, looking for that. You ask her. She knows those. She could recommend those. Most of them didn't recommend the teacher told Becky, but they told, her of other members of the class. So they clearly had that sense of self-confidence as readers, but they knew each other as readers and recognized each other as readers, not just as friends.
Yes.
That makes sense. And I think that's giving you a different level of well-being, because I'm competent, you're competent, we're both readers, we feel secure and agentic in our spaces, which is interesting.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think looks like we're starting to, we're down to just a few of us left, that people have obviously had to leave
Scoot.
now. So we'll close it now. I'll stop the recording, and just want to say thank you so much for coming. That was fascinating. And I must admit, reading isn't even the area I teach about, or